This is basically where I go to work every day, and I can tell you I would not exchange this place for anything else in the world. And here, as you can see, is a huge airplane, but this is what I would say a pilot's airplane, really. I like it.
Test pilots like former NASA astronaut Maurizio Cheli have had a decisive role in the plane's design. Each of the 4 partner nations has built specific sections of the fighter.
And here, I would say my wing, because I'm Italian, but of course, and this is sort of a joke, and as such you should take it, because the airplane is made by 4 countries. For example, this wing was made in Italy, and the opposite wing was made in Spain. But they match, and this is what makes the airplane amazing.
Maurizio is about to strut his stuff. Cheli flaunts the plane's maneuverability to the onlookers at this year's Paris Air Show, among them defence analyst Andrew Brooks.
This is a European Air Force in making. I mean, this is a European dream, a combat airplane produced by Europe to take on the world militarily and to take on America commercially.
Once full production is underway, 120,000 Europeans are expected to be employed on this weapon of mass construction. Eurofighter's competitors are also out in force. National pride and tens of thousands of jobs are at stake. The French are making much of their rival plane, the Rafale. But 20 years ago, they were to be partners in what was to become the Eurofighter project. Their withdrawal was one among the many complications that has dogged the long and eventful attempt at European collaboration.
This is a story of Europe learning to stand on its own feet. It's done it very well. It had a traumatic evolution process. There were a lot of stumbles on the way. Let's be honest about this. Nations came into this, we didn't have necessarily a big record in building 5th generation sophisticated airplanes. They had to learn from scratch. And when you're at the leading edge, there are going to be problems. You're cutting edge technology. We shouldn't underestimate the challenge they took on.
It was the arms race of the Cold War that brought the project into being. During the 1980s, the Western Air Forces were deeply concerned about the technological advances the Russians were making. They had developed not one, but 2 very agile fighter aircraft. The planes were causing great anxiety, as independent analyst Paul Beaver explains.
The first was from the famous Mikoyan stable, the MiG-29, and the second was from the Sukhoi Bureau, the Su-27. Both looked, from intelligence estimates, to be better than the existing F-16 in service, mainly with the Americans and continental Europeans, but certainly better than anything that the British had.
The British needed to replace their fleet of aging aircraft, the light air attack Jaguar and the US Phantom fighters. They were reliable, but couldn't cope with the Soviet aircraft. But jobs were important too. The Labour government of the early 60s caused an outrage when it cancelled a British fighter programme in favour of the American Phantom. Thousands of British workers were left without a job. Politically, this couldn't be repeated, and the new fighter would have to be made in Europe. For Chris Granville-White, then of the Ministry of Defence and a former RAF pilot, there was already a successful joint venture, the Tornado programme, that would serve as a role model for a new, wider European collaboration.
So in the early part of 1983, we went and talked to some of the other air forces, and it was fairly obvious who we should talk to. We talked to our former Tornado partners, the Germans and the Italians. We talked to the French, because we'd had the Anglo-French Jaguar program.
Just when there was the spark of a possible collaboration between these four nations, the Spanish applied to join them.
At that time, we knew that it was not only beneficial from a strategic point of view, which it is definitely, but also from an industrial point of view. And we foresaw that it could represent a lot of jobs creating.
The idea was that by sharing work and resources, the five nations would obtain an expensive aircraft at a lower cost to each country. But not everyone was in harmony.
The interest, particularly in four of the nations, was primarily air-to-air, air superiority, air defence and air-to-air combat, and that was applicable to four of the nations as a primary requirement, and then with a secondary requirement of air-to-surface to varying degrees between the four nations. France had a different perspective, which was, it was complementary, but it was different in that their primary requirement was offensive air-to-surface, and then with the air-to-air, air superiority capability as a second facet to that. So we always had this slight difference between four and one nations, and it was a question of seeing how we could balance these out.
The French government and their manufacturers Dassault persisted in promoting their air-to-ground fighter design over the air-to-air design favoured by the other four countries. Nevertheless, negotiations for the fighter program continued for 2 years. Martin Fremer, a German engineer, had already collaborated on the Tornado with the British. He was invited to work on the new project.
Our task was to come together on one project, one program, one cost estimates, and obviously one management. And this was the task of that exercise, and we were quite successful actually of achieving this. Because in that period from 83 to 85, we established on a quintuple base, including Dassault, a project. We managed to define the development cost. We had the work share established.
Despite the optimism, the first cracks in the new European venture began to show.
Now other news, and European defence ministers are meeting in London in a last attempt to save their joint project for new fighter aircraft. 5 NATO countries had planned to spend £20 billion, but it seems they can't reach agreement.
It's more than 2 years since Britain, France, Germany, Italy and Spain first talked about developing a joint fighter for the 1990s.
And we were close in believing that we can continue on the quintilateral base. However, at the end we failed.
In 1985, irreconcilable differences on the design led the French to leave the negotiating table. They saw their security better served by a ground attack aircraft and went on to develop the Rafale at great cost. But there was more to their departure than met the eye.
It was in essence the control of the program. They were requesting all major posts in the organization, like the program management, the commercial side, and even the technical side. To a certain degree, I still regret that they haven't continued with us, because I believe this aircraft would have even more chances now than it has already.
But losing one partner didn't alter the 4 remaining nations' confidence in the project. Although they had lost 2 years in negotiations with the French, they were still optimistic.
So the aim was get this aircraft into service in the early to mid-1990s. But all the indications were that probably the costs could be kept down and that the aircraft could be in service as early as 1992, and that from then onwards it would be a matter of progressing its upgrades until around 2002.
These ambitions proved impossible to fulfill. On the management side, although the 4 governments, their air forces and 8 defence contractors had the same objectives, they all had different incentives to take part. On the engineering side, the specifications were going to be somewhat more complicated than those faced by their colleagues on civilian programs. The problem is explained by Dave Rees, test pilot coordinator for the program.
Building a military fighter is so different to building an airliner. In the case of the airliner, the flight control system has to cope with a benign flying envelope. In simple terms, it's got to cope with a takeoff, a cruise, a landing. Nice and smooth, no spilling of the gin and tonic, some gentle turns, easy. As long as it does it safely, it's done its task. If you now think of the flight control system of an agile fighter, it's a different ballgame. It's got to cope with rapid rolling. It's got to cope with 9G. It's got to cope with very aggressive flying on the part of the pilot. It's a far more challenging exercise for the flight control system to manage.
So challenging, in fact, that negotiations took another 3 years. And it was not until 1988 that the four nations finally signed a contract for the development phase of the project. They agreed to build 7 prototypes of what was now to be called the European Fighter Aircraft, or EFA, with full production commencing in 1992, when work would begin on 765 fighters. The first planes would be delivered to their respective air forces in 1998. The cost-in prices of the day was projected to be £20 billion. But just as it was getting underway, the collaboration reached its second major obstacle, with the fallout from the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, and literally overnight, the Berlin Wall crumbled to pieces. The following 3 years would see the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the end of the Soviet Union. The Cold War imperative that created the Eurofighter vanished, just as the first prototypes were being built. The future of the program was in question.
Suddenly here was a reunited Germany, and it was very, very clear from the beginning that the German government needed to invest in Eastern Germany to bring them up to speed with the West. In other words, they needed to spend money, invest money. Now, the first thing that governments do is, when they have this situation, is cut defence programmes. It doesn't matter what it is. You can never cut education or health or social services. It's always defence which goes first.
And sure enough, in the 1990 German electoral campaign, Chancellor Helmut Kohl promised his anti-war supporters to cancel the EFA should he remain Chancellor. Once re-elected, Kohl's Defence Secretary Volker Ruhr threatened to opt out of the programme. The future of the four nations' aircraft industry depended on his final decision.
Mr. Ruhr and his British counterpart Malcolm Rifkind looked cheerful enough, but their talks today produced no agreement. The German government says the technology tested for the European fighter on this demonstrator aircraft should now be used to develop a cheaper, lighter plane. Britain objects, but Germany still says it wants a new fighter to be more in keeping with a Europe no longer threatened by Soviet invasion. This afternoon, though, Mr. Ruhr was anxious to maintain a good relationship with Britain. I don't want it to end with the European fighter, he said, but times had changed.
We very definitely feel that there is a new situation in Europe, and the plane has to adjust to the security situation and not the other way around.
In the UK, Ruhr's argument was not well received. Fearing for their jobs, hundreds of British aerospace workers protested in London. The pressure was on Malcolm Rifkind, the newly appointed Defence Secretary to John Major's cabinet, to ensure the Eurofighter would continue.
When you arrive as new Defence Secretary and there is this immediate high drama of whether the biggest procurement program ever in British defence history